Good afternoon and welcome to this ICAW webinar, How to Ensure Your Charity Board is Financially Competent, which we're holding in association with MHA to mark the start of Trustees Week today. My name is Christina Kobick. I'm the Head of Charity and Voluntary Sector here at ICAW, and I will be a facilitator for today's session. MHA are the perfect partners for this Trustees Week special webinar, not only because of their charity expertise, but also because they have a dedicated trustee hub that includes helpful templates for policies and procedures, help sheets and checklists, webinars, and more. We will share a link to this with you shortly, and I'd really encourage you to go and have a look. Raising the competence of charity boards is also very important to us at ICAW. That's why we have a dedicated volunteering community, which offers free online trustee training to all members, and soon extended also to all ICW members. If you want to find out more about that, please let us know in the survey after the webinar, where we have included a question specifically about that. But before we get started, we would like to run a quick poll to find out how financially competent you think your charity board are. So you hopefully can see a poll now coming up on your screen. And we're asking you to rate how the financial competency of your whole charity board of trustees is, ranking them from 1, which means poor, to 5, which means outstanding. Now, you might be advising trustee boards rather than being a trustee yourself, so you can apply that also to your charity clients. And if you have a dual role, so for example, if you're trustees but you also advise charities, then in the spirit of Trustees Week, please answer your questions from your perspective as a trustee. This is all anonymous and we won't see your individual choice. We will only see the stats at the end for all of you. So you can be open and honest here. So we'll just give it one more minute to see what answers come up, and they will really help inform the presentation. So, oh, we have the results. That's brilliant. So 50% of you say rate the average financial competency of your charity board as 3, sort of midway. 32% as number 4, so high competency, and 2% say the financial competence of your board is outstanding. Only 3% say it is poor and 14% ranked it as 2. So that's really interesting. So we have a sort of mid-level financial competency. So if we close the poll again, it is now my pleasure to introduce our 2 speakers from MHA, Sudhir Singh and Helen Blundell. Sudhir is a partner and head of not-for-profit at MHA. Sudhir has been a specialist not-for-profit audit partner for 20 years. He has also extensive experience as a trustee and is currently a member of the Council of the Royal College of Art. Helen is a not-for-profit director with more than 20 years experience in the not-for-profit sector, including working with charities, academies, schools, and other not-for-profit bodies, and holds the ICAW Diploma in Charity Accounting, as well as a postgraduate certificate in Charity Accounting and Financial Management. Sudhir will start us off and then hand over to Helen. So for now, let's hand over to Sudhir.
Thank you very much, Christina, and really delighted with Helen to be with you this morning. I'm going to, in a moment, just share my screen, so hopefully you'll be able to see our slides. Sorry, just to share. Hopefully you can now see that. I'm sure Christina will tell me if not. But Helen and I are really delighted to be here, especially as today is the first day of Trustee Week, so it feels very apt to be talking about trustee matters, albeit I know that some of you may not be, or you may be advisors, but I suspect all of you, or many of you, will be accountants. Now, both I and Helen are wholly dedicated to working in the charity sector, but we are also charity trustees and have been mainly for a number of decades. So both work and personally, this is a really important subject to us. So hopefully you'll see our passion as we go through. So I'm going to be kicking off just to take you through the webinar, and I'm going to be handing over to Helen in a moment. So what we're going to do in terms of this webinar is think about what the concern is about financial competency, and really helpful to have that whole to start off with, because I think it's going to actually align with many of the messages that we're talking about, which is, I think, looking at those numbers, around a third of you, only about a third of you, are saying financial competency is either good or outstanding. And that's all, and only 2% outstanding. So that very much aligns, I think, with our view about, wouldn't it be great for all us to be aiming for outstanding throughout? So that's really where we're going to be starting. We're going to talk about that concern. We're going to talk about the key attributes to financial governance and competency in charities. Then I'm going to hand on to Helen, who's going to talk about securing commitment, avoiding complacency, establishing skills, and then I'm going to finish off talking about instilling competency, and then with a conclusion about a call to action. I hope that's going to be good for you. But where's the starting point? And this slide says, what's the concern? I mean, indeed, is there a concern? Especially given that charity trustees generally are wholly motivated by having good intentions. They are often, the trustees are often highly able people. They tend to often have good competency in a number of areas, and certainly financial competency is an unquestioned expectation for trustees. And those financial expectations are pretty well and clearly set out. For example, the Charity Commission guidance is pretty clear in this area, whether that's looking at the long-term guidance the Charity Commission has had, or even more recent guidance. They published a year ago, actually, in Trustee Week last year, in November 2020, their 5-minute guides, and one of which was on finance. And there are things like the Charity Commission publication, 15 questions trustees should ask, 12 of which are finance related. So there is a lot of suggestions that, is this really a concern? Well, however, despite all of that, I think it's important to recognise there have been various surveys. Indeed, we with Charity Finance Group have done surveys in the past. The Charity Commission itself has done surveys, all which suggest that financial governance could be better, pretty well aligned with our polls just done. Just looking at what the Charity Commission is saying recently in their annual report for 2021, fairly recently published, they talk about it's being a reasonable expectation amongst the public that charities should be thinking about not just what they do, but how they do it. You know, and they really talk about trying to improve and being better than mere compliance. And that's really pointing to the fact that charities could be doing better. Certainly, anecdotally, we at MHA, we act for around about 1,200 charities and not-for-profit organisations. And we do see that trustees almost always are highly committed. But we do think outstanding financial competency is pretty rare. And as we just presented, us on the involved today are saying that they're seeing outstanding competency. So what that does point to is perhaps mediocrity is a little bit too prevalent in the sector. Here, I quite like the way that Ofsted does their gradings. As many of you will be aware, they have 5 levels. The highest level being outstanding, then good, and then the next level down used to be called satisfactory, but Ofsted now uses the term requires improvement. And actually, I quite like that characterization, that satisfactory isn't good enough, so we should be seeking to improve. And hopefully that's what you're feeling yourselves. But also, I think it's important to reflect that this is we're aiming for a post-pandemic environment, and we do see that charities are going to be likely to be facing increased levels of challenges. And also, what we've seen through the pandemic is greater division, for example, between the have-lots and the have-nots in the charity sector. The have-lots charities have done quite well financially, as opposed to the have-nots, those charities that have really found it quite a challenge and a struggle. In either case, financial competency is going to be really essential for those charities to be successful. So, given that performance should be improved, how can that performance be improved? And what are the key attributes associated with that? And we're going to suggest to you in this webinar a template model. Of course, there are lots of alternatives you might want to look at, and we certainly don't object to you doing a pick and mix approach. Just take whatever you want from what Helen and I are going to say. But we're going to give you a little framework about how to instill high levels of competency. In this case, we're talking about financial competency, but actually this model would work in any area of skill deficiency within your charity, just with a slight adaptation. So we're going to start with a model that's based on an assertion. That assertion is that for a board to be highly financially competent, the appropriate goal is engagement on financial matters universally across all trustees. And we'd like to suggest that could be broken down into two broad areas. First of all, engagement, ensuring that trustees are addressing financial issues appropriately and effectively. That's all about securing commitment and avoiding complacency. And secondly, a universality. In other words, recognizing that all trustees have joint and several responsibilities, and no one trustee can abdicate their responsibility. And so, therefore, that involvement needs to be wholeheartedly and conscientiously demonstrated, and doing that by establishing skills that are appropriate and instilling appropriate levels of competency as well. So, if you don't have those key attributes, in other words, you have factors that are influencing your charities such that there isn't that adequate engagement and there isn't that universal involvement, what are the reasons and what are the things that can cause those failures? Just to explore that just briefly. First of all, thinking about inadequate engagement, what can contribute to that? Well, here are a few thoughts, and it's going to be different in all cases, but some things that we often see. First of all, understanding of trustees' personal or their group role. Often you may find trustees saying, well, I'm not the treasurer, I'm not on the finance committee, so therefore it's not part of my trustee duties. Secondly, you might find people who just don't have sufficient involvement. Simply put, it's not devoting enough time to their responsibilities. Thirdly, maybe it's about personal or corporate attitudes. Maybe financial information is not adequately shared with the board, or maybe the papers that trustees get are just not adequate. Maybe they're poor. It could be about motivation. Trustees that don't recognize the importance of finance. They say, I'm here for the cause. I'm not here to talk about what they perceive as just internal administration. It could be even something about governance and leadership. It could be that the chair, the treasurer, the CEO, the chief financial officer just doesn't encourage participation in financial matters. Or it could be something about governance structures. Maybe detailed consideration of finance is devolved down to subcommittees, and you end up with the wider board just rubber stamping those decisions. So it could be a lot of things. There are probably things that you can think about in your situations. What about insufficient universality? Again, quite a number of things, but I think often the starting point is knowledge. Trustees that just don't know there are financial questions that they ought to be asking. Or perhaps they do know that, but they don't have the ability in finance to ask those questions. And maybe they do have that ability, but they don't have the experience to know when or what to ask. Or perhaps they're just fearful of looking either stupid or foolish, perhaps, in asking those questions. It could be that the charity perceives it lacks the resources to enable or empower all trustees to be involved in financial matters. Or perhaps it doesn't have adequate resources for induction and training. As I said, there could be lots of things that barriers and issues that cause problems. We like to characterize this as barriers to engagement being in the areas of commitment and complacency, and barriers to universality being skills and competency. And we've just summarized this in a little table that we would like to characterize as a financial competency matrix. And what this does is it sets out the outcomes for that we want. It sets out which is engagement and universality. It talks about what the barriers might be for those, being commitment, complacency, skills, and competency. And then it sets out some enablers that charities can put in place to overcome those barriers. And this framework is really what we're going to spend the rest of our presentation focusing on. So I'm going to hand on to Helen in a moment to talk about commitment, complacency, and skills. I'll then complete on competency. So Helen, over to you to talk about securing commitment.
Thank you, Sudhir. Can you move on to the next slide for me? Thank you. So I'm going to start looking at securing commitment, and I think this is about starting from the right place. If the trustees aren't able to give sufficient time or make sufficient effort, then where have you started from? I think I've heard on a number of occasions people talk about we need a treasurer or we need a trustee, and it's only an hour once a month or once a quarter or something similar. And the reality of being a trustee is that it isn't just showing your face at the meetings. I'm sure that many of you as trustees may have been to meetings where you know who's going to not turn up at the meeting or who's going to be late, maybe who hasn't read the papers, doesn't bring the papers with them or leaves them on the table as they depart. And I think it's easy to think that because this is a voluntary role, actually it's not appropriate or it's not okay to challenge trustees about their behaviours. But I think ultimately everybody is collectively responsible. If it was their own personal business, I suspect that they might pay a little bit more attention to those matters. Can you move on to the next slide, Sudhir? Thank you. So starting from the right place, being clear about what's expected, not underselling the role of the trustee, making it quite clear as to how often the trustee meetings are, but actually also the additional work that needs to be put in there. Maybe it's something around the timings of meetings, when meetings take place, being clear about what additional training might be required, but also that trustee contract, the idea of having an agreement between the trustees and the charity is also about the charity being clear about what you're asking of your trustees as well. I have on occasion been invited to attend a meeting on a Friday evening, a trustee meeting. When it starts on a Friday evening at 7:30 and you know it's not going to finish till 11:30, it's not very attractive to securing the commitment of a trustee. So thinking about what you have on your agendas, how you're going to set out those meetings to make sure that the information that you need to get through is done in sizable chunks and that you can buy the engagement of all the individuals attending. When I was serving as a trustee, we made some revisions to our board agendas and papers that came out that I felt was quite helpful, because at times I knew that I was going to be pushed for time to invest in preparing for the meetings. And so actually prioritising the board agenda and talking about which of those agenda items I would need to have read the papers, because there was going to be a discussion about it and we as trustees were going to be making a decision on it. I would then focus on those areas. items on the agenda where it was just a presentation, an update on particular developments, there was perhaps less need for me to have thoroughly researched and considered that particular point on the agenda. So I think it's a collective responsibility around securing that commitment. It's not just about the trustees needing to be willing to put the time and the effort in, but it's also about the charity itself being clear about what's expected, making sure that you play your part in helping to train, helping to arrange meetings and agenda levels so that it's appropriate for those that are attending. Another way of looking at that commitment is also to think about the performance of the charity's board. Now, I don't know about you, but my heart sinks when it comes around to appraisal times, and that's in a work environment. So I can very much understand why charity boards of trustees may be reluctant to roll out a programme of appraisals. But again, this can be either at the individual level or at the committee level or at the board as a whole. And it might be as simple as adding an agenda point towards the end of the meeting where you just take 5 minutes to reflect on what's been discussed in that board meeting, and actually, is there anything that would have made it easier? Is there, could papers have been presented in a different way? Have we deferred decisions again? Is that because there was information that was missing and a decision couldn't be taken? And just that 5 minutes of reflection may be worthwhile. I think the other thing that you need to remember about performance of the board is that it's not just about how many meetings people attend. It's very easy to be physically present in the meeting, but actually not present in your mind and in your contribution to those agenda items. So don't just look at whether somebody is there, but actually reflect on, are we quorate? Are we making decisions on a timely basis? Are we moving on agenda items in an appropriate way? Are we making decisions at the right point in time? It's very easy as a board member to perhaps think, oh, well, I want to ask a question, but I'm not sure that this is the appropriate time to ask that question. But it's remembering that this is a collective decision-making process, and that as a board, you need to be open and honest in discussing those items. When I first joined a board of trustees, we spent quite a lot of time over a number of meetings discussing a particular item. And after a period of time, a couple of us who were relatively new to the board actually stopped and said, can we just ask why we're discussing this? What's this about? And there was actually almost a collective sigh of relief around the table, because people had realised that regulation had got in the way, and the original idea was central to our purpose, but we'd strayed from that, and actually we were devoting rather a lot of time to something that wasn't a central part of our charitable purpose and wasn't going to make an impact. And that collective sigh of relief really stays with me, because it highlighted the importance of being brave and being willing to ask the stupid question. Could you move on to the next slide for me, Sadir, please? So how do we avoid complacency? Is it that trustees just can't be bothered to discuss finance? As Sadir said, when we join the board of trustees, probably we don't join the board thinking, I'm passionate about finance, I really must join this board of trustees. Usually you've joined it because you're passionate about the cause. You want to make a difference. And so finance can sometimes feel like it's the constraining factor for charities and for moving forward ideas in a board meeting. But there are too many meetings that I've been to over the years where I've maybe been presenting the statutory accounts to the board for approval, where I make my presentation and then there's pause. and the chair of trustees and the rest of the trustees around the table look to the treasurer and say, are you happy with these? If the treasurer is willing to say yes, then that's it. Everybody else is willing to second the approval of those financial statements. And I'm guessing that most of the people that are on this webinar are actually probably accountants themselves. So you may well have been in that position yourself where all eyes are on you. But that shouldn't be the case at all. And we shouldn't be afraid to say, actually, no, it's not my responsibility individually. It's our responsibility collectively. And maybe people don't realise that. Maybe some of those on the Board of Trustees know that they're there because they've got a background in safeguarding, or they've got a background in marketing or HR, whatever their skill set is. But as a board, collectively, it's everybody's responsibility. You move on to the next slide, Sudhir. Thank you. So why is this? Why are trustees perhaps failing in their responsibilities on the finance side of things? I think finance can often be, as I say, the constraining factor, but equally finance in the context of a charity shouldn't be the tail that's wagging the dog. Sometimes it's that you have to make a decision around how you use your resources. Understanding that the nature of the charity's financial position isn't, does it contribute to profit? And then if it does, then that's okay. And if it does, no, we can't go ahead with that. But the board need to be making conscious decisions about the impact on the finances of those ideas and that passion. I certainly wouldn't want to see a charity restrained in its actions simply because there is that action is going to cost money. It's about it being an enabler to making a sensible decision. We can sometimes see finance people sitting on boards of trustees and making decisions, making comments and observations about how finance is used, and that we can't head this way, or we can't spend this money and we can't make that investment. But we need to understand together why that needs to be made. We were running I was on a webinar a week or so ago talking about business cases. And often an idea will be presented to you as a board for development of a service, response to a demand and a need. And in this current climate, the pandemic, there's needed to be a shift in the way that we've responded to things. And the sorry, I forgot where I've forgotten for a moment where I was going on that one. The business case is presented in terms of actually the impact that you're going to make and how you're going to move forward. But sometimes the missing chunk of that consideration is actually the financial side of things. Have the management team looked at how that's going, what that's going to cost you, how you're going to use your resources, and what the financial impact is there. It may not be that you need reams and reams of calculations and to be blinded with figures, but you do need to understand that if you take a course of action, what is the impact of that action financially on the charity? Does that change how you're able to deliver another piece of work? Does it change whether you can invest in another area of the business? Does it change whether you can afford to resource that in terms of personnel? How do you get out of this circle, though, where there's a lack of understanding or appreciation of the finance. And the finance is either the block because people won't take a course of action because of the financial implication, or on the other side, it's just completely disregarded. It's about understanding where you are and what that impact is. Can we move on to the next slide, Sadir? We can all sit round a table and say that we should reflect. And I think informally, a review will never work. It's really important that there's a structure to that consideration and that decision making about how you assess the ability of the charity in the context of its finances. So there are a number of ways that you could approach this, and Christina talked at the beginning about the ICAW charity trustee modules as training. It may be that you schedule a board meeting during the year to consider and reflect on where you are as part of the strategy and how you can better equip each of the trustees. It may be more appropriate to look at an external review. Sometimes it's very difficult to see the performance objectively when you are in attendance at a meeting on a year-by-year or day-to-day basis. My experience as I joined a board as a new trustee, actually new trustees can perhaps provide some useful feedback in those early stages. They may be reluctant to give that feedback, but in an open and honest environment in the trustee board where you encourage people to make a contribution regardless of their perception of their ability to make a difference, is helpful to contributing to that process. The Good Governance Code recommends that you have some form of an external review of governance on a every 3 years or so. And you may have a focus to that governance element, maybe financial, or it may be in other areas of the work. And it's appropriate maybe to divide those up into different ways and look at it on a cyclical basis. Maybe each year review some element of your governance, but making sure that finance is a part of that. As Sadir said, the questionnaire, the 15 questions for boards of trustees that the Charity Commission produce, the majority of those questions are around understanding the financial responsibilities. They're not about dictating the actions of the charity, but they're about understanding the financial position and the context of the charity in order to be able to be a facilitator, to be able to move forward those plans in an appropriate way. The Charity Commission, the Charity Governance Code also talks about applying or explaining, and it may be as a board that you could look at some aspects of that code and think, do we do this? But then have more of a formal consideration about, if we don't do this, how do we explain why we don't? And is that a sufficiently appropriate justification? Moving on to the next slide, Sadir. So the skills side, we're probably all got a finance background on this webinar. But what we also have to remember is that there are varying degrees of those skills. As accountants, we will be held to a higher duty of care in relation to the finances of the charity. But going back to that point about us being collectively responsible as a board of trustees, it's important for you as accountants to know that your fellow boards of trustees are considering the financial side and understand it and can challenge and be robust in their challenge so that collectively you can take responsibility. My husband many years ago was on the school PTA, and he resigned in the end because actually he felt that the rest of the board didn't take seriously enough the compliance responsibilities of that role. And he recognised that the head teacher would not ask any of their teaching staff to participate in an organisation where where there was little regard for safeguarding, because they as professionals would have been impacted by that disregard. And it's the same for us as accountants. And so it is a serious concern if the Board of Trustees collectively have insufficient skills to be able to take those decisions, and all eyes rest on you. It's hard. I'm sure that you, if you had £1 for every time you've been asked whether you would consider being a trustee, you'd probably be millionaires by now. It is often hard to find people with the relevant finance skills. And so actually being a board that is willing to invest in upskilling the trustees to engage in training and understanding the basics. What we don't want is to have 10 or 12 accountants on a board, because we've all got similar skill sets. We need a diverse board, but we also need people who understand the basic building blocks of why the financial considerations are such an important part of the decision-making process. Equal responsibility doesn't mean equal levels of skills and competency. And move on to the next slide, Sadir. So I think a starting place for considering the financial competency of the board is maybe to ask that question that we asked at the beginning of this process. As trustees, do you consider that your board is financially competent? And maybe also ask that question of the individuals themselves. Do they feel that they are financially competent to be able to contribute to those discussions of the on the finances of the charity? When you're recruiting, be clear about what it is that you expect of your trustees, and make sure that you equip them with some of the tools and the building blocks to allow them to make sure that they understand their responsibilities, and also to know what questions they need to be asking. The Charity Commission has plenty of guidance on their website, and CC30 is listed there, but there are plenty of other resources. And similarly, there are plenty of resources on our trustee hub. ICAW is another good place to start in looking to recruit as well. Every trustee will need some training. Some training for some trustees can be at quite a basic level. Other training might be at a higher level if you maybe wanted to upskill a trustee to be part of the finance committee. But I think it's important to remember that no question is too stupid a question. And if you can encourage a culture in your trustee board of being honest and open and to ask the stupid questions, then actually you will find that as a board, you're probably becoming more financially competent there. There is plenty, particularly with the pandemic, a lot of training has gone online. So there is an abundance of training and resources that can help support trustees, but also invest financially in that training. I think sometimes there's this sense that if the training's free, then it can't be quality enough. Or maybe that the trustees themselves, their skills are not important enough to invest in them financially as a charity. And I think those are important messages for your trustees. Give them some guidance. Consider how you can improve your board papers, and maybe buddy up trustees so that they can get support from other trustees and learn a little bit more in depth. how they move forward. I'm going to hand back to Sudhir to look at instilling that competency further.
Thank you very much, Helen. Yes, I want to move on to the issue of competency and how we instill that across the whole of the trustee board. And I think many of you will be familiar with the Charity Governance Code. It's been around in various iterations for around a decade or so, and it's always a useful starting point for many of us in charities. But the starting point of that code is what's called the foundation principle. And that's that the trustee role and charity context is important. And it's all about bringing understanding and commitment of trustees to their role and their responsibilities, but in the situation of their particular charity and what it does. So what this and the code suggests, it's not just an issue about skills, but it's about how those skills are used, the application of those skills. So just let's think a bit about that. What does somebody being competent, what makes somebody competent? Well, I think the first point is having relevant skills. And those need to be skills that are specific to the financial circumstances of the charity. So it's really important that you understand what those particular circumstances are, because all charities have different challenges and important that the skills are tailored accordingly. The second thing is understanding how to apply trustees' skills, recognizing that the financial management of charities can be radically different to that of a commercial organization. And in fact, actually adopting the same approach as in a commercial setting can actually be quite harmful for a charity. And thirdly, recognizing when trustees have appropriate knowledge. Now, when is appropriate knowledge held? Because being an expert in a chosen field, accountancy, may indicate a great ability and potential to be an outstanding trustee. But the charity sector has quite a number, many, in fact, unique aspects to its regulatory and operational frameworks. And it's really important that trustees have a sector-specific approach to that. So how do you ensure trustees are competent? Well, here's a way to suggest you could adopt in your own charities or if you're advising a charity. The first is to think about using a competency framework. There's lots of guidance about competency frameworks, but I have to say in the charity sector, they don't seem to exist. The only one I've ever come across is for academy schools. The Department for Education has issued a competency framework there in relation to finance in particular. But in the simplest form, a competency framework is really just a list of the necessary and desirable areas of competency. And the advantage of having that list is it can be used by an individual trustee in their personal reflection to think about any gaps in skills and knowledge that they have in order to be considered to be competent. I think this goes alongside having a culture, though, of honest feedback, as well as what Helen was talking about, appraisal of competency of individual trustees. And I think that's important because it can identify where action may be needed. And I'm going to suggest that it should be the responsibility of the chair, either of the whole board or of a particular committee. In this case, I would have thought the finance committee, if you have one, to establish and maintain that sort of culture, appropriate culture, in being honest and identifying where skills and competency need to be developed. But what sort of things am I talking about when I'm talking about these sort of areas? Well, you're mainly accountants, I'm sure, so I'm sure you understand the need for basic financial skills in things like financial management, financial accounting, those sorts of areas. So I won't touch on those because I think most of you either are ICAW members or perhaps have other accounting qualifications, and you have an understanding of what I mean by those basic core competencies. I think what I wanted to focus on is some of the very specific technical competencies that are key for charities. And on this slide, I've listed some of the typical core areas. I won't go through them all, I'm sure you can read them, and many of these things will be familiar to you. And I think this is important to have this sort of competency list in order that your trustees consider their competency level. And I think it's important that you, as I said, tailor this for your particular circumstances of your charities, because some of these areas you'll think that just having an awareness is important. In other areas, you'll think that actually I need an in-depth understanding. Awareness is something that perhaps all trustees might need in these areas, but perhaps that in-depth understanding is just needed by some of those with the greater level of skill in finance. Either way, having this sort of checklist, I think, can actually be helpful in it's understanding what you don't know as well as what you do know is really important here. Just want to move on to just some conclusions there. For questions. So what's our call to action? Well, as we've seen, trustees have a legal duty to always consider the best interests of their beneficiaries. And I think it's a given that strong and effective engagement by trustees in finance really does make a tangible difference to the impact of that charity on their beneficiaries. And therefore, striving for outstanding performance really is essential. We saw in the poll earlier, only 2% of us were saying that we were seeing outstanding financial competency. There's also, I wanted to highlight, there's a increased recognition that it's not only systems and processes that are important, but it's also the softer areas of attitudes and behaviours. And there's really no silver bullets to this. Hopefully we've given you some thoughts, but I think the most important thing is to say it's an awareness of these issues and seeking to do at least something that will result in some significant benefits. I think it's also important to recognise that the charity mission has reported there is a gap between the support that's available to trustees and the uptake of that support. There's lots, as I said, both Helen and I refer to this in a number of occasions. A lot of support is available and guidance. The Charity Commission does produce some really excellent material. The ICA EW, likewise, in the trustee training modules, and lots of professional advisors provide guidance. And I'll give you a link shortly to the MHA Trustee Hub. Do think about what we've been saying. Hopefully we've given you a framework to think about what you can do in your own charities or if you're advising charities. I think my final comment is that I really consider that mediocrity is the silent killer of achievement. And therefore, for our charity beneficiaries, they do deserve that we do the best we possibly can. So I really hope this has been helpful. So final slide is really just to say we're delighted to take some questions. There are some contact details for myself and Helen, and there's also our link to our Charity Trustee Hub. That has a guide on which this presentation is based. It's available there for you, plus also tools and templates so you can assess good governance and also to support it as well. Christina, back to you.
Thank you very much, Sidi, and also thank you to you, Helen. I thought it was a really interesting presentation, how you put together the framework and thought about the different kind of competencies to build that financial awareness, which I think is so important, as you said, and I really liked how you brought it back to the actual cause and the beneficiaries that will be the recipients of the financial competence. So let's go into the Q&A. We have 2 questions there already. So I'll start with Ben's question. Ben says, I find papers presented to the board too long when 1 page would be efficient. I will not print papers to read due to the quantity to be printed. I think that's familiar to us all. 2 monthly board meetings I feel are no longer necessary and are creating pressure on everyone. What do you think? Maybe let's start with you, Sudhir.
Okay, yes, Ben, really familiar sort of situations and pretty common. I think it's got to be what's appropriate for your charity and its particular circumstances. Um, I said earlier that Helen and I are both trustees. I remember on several occasions as a trustee getting a pack of papers of over 200 pages. So I was actually I thought a couple of pages didn't seem too bad, to be honest. Um, I think the most important thing is that it gives you the required information so you can make the appropriate decisions. And as Helen said, that I think trustee papers are absolutely essential in terms of determining good financial governance. If the information isn't well presented, I think that's always quite makes things difficult. And certainly something that's succinct and to the point and makes it really clear what trustees' actions need to be, I think is certainly really helpful. And likewise, in terms of how regular meetings are, again, it's been really helpful. I think that because of virtual meetings, we've trustees have been able to have meetings much more swiftly and regularly, and that's been absolutely essential during the pandemic and actually shown. Who would have thought that charity trustees can make decisions quickly? We now know you can do that. There's almost overnight. So there's I think some positives, but we should go back to what's appropriate. Yeah. So maybe the level that you are at, Ben, maybe is too much, but I wouldn't like to set as minimum standard. Helen, I don't know if you want to say anything.
Yeah, I think it depends on the circumstances of the charity, and a grant making charity could maybe meet once a quarter and agree their grants at that point in time. A different charity working in a different way might want to meet more regularly, and that may also depend on their financial position as well. If there's crisis management, then more regular meetings, and certainly I had 1 or 2 boards of trustees who were meeting every fortnight at the beginning of the pandemic, not for a really long meeting, but for much shorter kind of proactive and focused meetings to make decisions sort of promptly and appropriately.
Great, thank you. And maybe just a good time to remind everybody to just check the governing document if you can hold your meetings online still. But the next question from Victoria, I think, is super interesting. So do you think there's often a link between the financial competency of the senior leadership team as a whole, not just the FD, and the financial competency of the board as a whole?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree on that. And the presentation I was doing the other week about business cases, sometimes that is maybe that the senior management team want to move forward on a proposal, but maybe don't have the confidence or the capabilities maybe to put that information together in a way that they feel would be received by the board and allow them to move forward. So I think that's why it's important that the trustees have got confidence in their own ability to challenge either the financial information that's presented to them, or actually why financial information hasn't been presented to them as part of that decision-making proposal.
Yeah, I back that up completely. It sounds a bit harsh, but I think sometimes charity senior leadership teams get the financial governance that they deserve. So because they don't present the information in the right sort of way to actually financially competent trustees, and then they complain that they don't get the decisions that they want, and I think there is a lot to be said about that. So I think that I agree with you, Victoria. I think there can be a link. I suppose the fairer thing to say is it's equal responsibility, that both the senior leadership team and trustees need to work together effectively and have that common understanding, make it really clear, I think, from both sides, exactly what's appropriate and needed. I think that's probably the best way forward.
Thank you. There's a question from Paul. At what level of activity do you think a separate finance committee outside of the main trustee board would be appropriate? For example, by revenue, value of assets, number of employees as a measure?
Both Helen and I are obviously hesitating on answering this one. I'm not. It's really difficult to say, isn't it, Helen? I think exactly what there's no. I wouldn't say there's a particular measure that you can set. I think you've just got to determine if it's helpful to delegate some detailed consideration of financial matters. Then, if there is a benefit in that, then it is appropriate to set out that finance committee or some sort of committee to think about those specific things. So it's all about the issue about delegation of responsibility, and of course it's you're not delegating power; it's only the responsibility to consider things. So and it might be a matter of time that you don't have enough time for the full board to consider things, or it might be things like the fact that if you have a subcommittee, you can actually bring in non-executives, people who aren't trustees, to beef up your skills, whether that's finance or it could be something completely different. I mean, the digital skills at the moment are a big area where charities are lacking, and so you might want to you might be bringing somebody just to sit on that committee to provide that extra beefing up of skills. That's another good reason.
I think the other thing with committees is also just about being clear about the purpose. So, if you've got a board of trustees that's got 15 or 20 members on the trustee, I think for them to consider and discuss and approve a budget in the level of detail, it's too much. So it's more about where those smaller subgroups might be valuable in allowing a proper detailed consideration, so that then when it comes to the full board, that somebody's looked at it in detail rather than nobody's looked at it in detail or everybody's looked at it in too much detail. So it's about efficiency around those considerations, and the point that the gentleman made earlier about there's a lot of pressure on boards of trustees and meetings too often, etc. So if you can make the efficiency of the board better by having smaller working groups for specific points in time, maybe not the whole year round, but maybe the finance committee only meets twice a year, wants to go through the detailed stat accounts and wants to go through the budget approval process, then I think that's where it adds value to the process of board decision making.
Great, thank you. We have 2 more minutes and 2 more questions to answer here. So if you could keep your answers brief, then hopefully we can answer both. So Malcolm asked a question that made me smile. How do you deal with trustees in smaller charities who might be very senior, for example, chairmen of public companies, law lords and the like, and who simply do not believe they need training because they know it all and better than you?
Yeah, I understand your concern, Malcolm. I guess you get this in where trustees maybe are ex officio for appointed for other reasons, or maybe even vanity type trustees, if you like. They're appointed for the role. That's where maybe some sort of competency framework may be helpful, just to encourage them to use the established frameworks. So use the code of governance formally, but also use the sort of competency frameworks that we've suggested today, and ask individual trustees to fill those out and determine whether they've got those skills and competencies and commitments.
Thank you. And if you just move quickly to Matthew's questions, and then we finish there. I'm not an accountant, but I'm a trustee and treasurer. A key challenge in aiding trustee knowledge and capability is the quality of financial information gathered and reported by the charity's management. How best can trustees help drive improvement in this area when charity staff resources are stretched due to economics and the pandemic?
Helen, would you like to do this one?
I think it's a valid question, isn't it? And that's probably often why the senior leadership team maybe are not presenting that information to the board, because they're responding to the primary purposes and the demand and about delivering to the beneficiaries. I guess, again, it's looking at the skill set of the trustees. So can one of those individuals maybe work alongside a member of the management team, just to maybe not require them to produce a series of papers, but actually to have a verbal conversation so that a trustee can report back in similar ways. I think it's about understanding what capabilities, and this is where it comes back to establishing and understanding those skills, what capabilities people have, what format that information needs to be in, and then working alongside the senior leadership team, because the trustee role is not about undermining the management team. Neither is it about making their job too difficult by requiring too much information. So I think it's about looking at those, the context, and seeing whether there's a way that you can bridge that gap to make sure that the information does reach the trustees.
Thank you both. Unfortunately, we haven't answered all the questions, but we will get back to you. So if we haven't answered your question, we will get to you back to you offline with our answer. And that brings us to the end of today's webinar. So I would like to thank Sudhir and Helen for their insight and advice. And I would also like to thank you, our listeners, for your time and for your questions. I hope you found this session useful. A short feedback survey will pop up on your screen after the webinar finishes. Please do complete this, as your feedback is very important to us and helps us shape future events. We have also included a questions to find out if you would like to receive information on our trustee e-learning modules, so don't forget to tick the box for that. The webinar has been recorded, and we will send you a link to the on-demand recording tomorrow. And with that, I wish you a lovely sunny afternoon, and thank you and goodbye.